Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this Bright Blue Fringe event, which we're doing in partnership with IPPR North and Power to Change. So we're very grateful to those two organisations for partnering up with us. And the theme of today's debate is transformational times, which could be said about a lot of things, but particularly around levelling up and making levelling up felt by local communities. So in this hour and a quarter, we're going to hear from an expert panel. They'll have 5 minutes each, and then we're going to hear questions from you and contributions from you. And for those of you who are watching on the live stream, wherever you may be, hello. And if you want to ask questions, you can do so through Slido. Please tell us your name and the organisation that you're representing. If you're using social media, please do use Twitter and use the Twitter handle BrightBlue and CPC22, and you can also mention the organisation. So our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue, @IPPR, and @Power2Change. So, new government, new priorities. Will levelling up still be a priority for this government? I hope so, because we've got the levelling up minister with us. Still got a levelling up department. Really, we want to sort of ask a number of questions. So, what is going to be distinctive about this new government's approach to levelling up? Has there been measurable progress since 2019? Going into the next election, will voters in so-called left-behind areas feel that there has been measurable progress? To what extent is local leadership important for the levelling up agenda? And how can the private sector, as well as key government institutions, but the private sector and the voluntary sector, be energised to help with this agenda? So, on the panel, to my near left, I have Paul Scully, MP, who is the Minister for Local Government. To his left is Hetan Shah, who is the Chief Executive of the British Academy. And then to his left is Ailbhe McNabola. Have I got that right?
Don't worry.
Okay, no. In short, no. And she's the Director of Policy and Communications at Power to Change. To my near right is Dehenna Davison, who's the Minister for Levelling Up. To her right is Duncan who is the political editor of The Economist. And then Zoe Billingham at the end is the Director of IPPR North. So, let's start with Paul. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's always a pleasure to come and participate in the Bright Blue Fringe meetings. They're always really stimulating and interesting. So after I've spoken, maybe we can get to some stimulating, interesting discussions. It was great, actually, as I was coming up, the lady said, I wanted executive room 7. She said, sorry, the room's full. I said, oh, well, I'm speaking, so I'm sure it wasn't for me, but it was. It's great that actually this has a lot of interest, and it's understandable because this is something that is changing and will change people's lives. If you think about levelling up, we've had so much time and column inches and the like talking about what levelling up means. I always boil it down to just start with people. It's all about levelling up people. You work for that. It's all about realising potential, gaining opportunity, no matter where you live. So therefore, geography kicks into it pretty quickly, as does infrastructure. Now, I'm also Minister for London, and there's plenty of work that we need to be doing to levelling up London. You can be in Westminster, as Dehenna and I often are, clearly, and you go east on the Jubilee line for every station that you go east. The residents there lose a year on their life expectancy, their average life expectancy. So there's plenty to be done in London, but when you're looking at things like businesses and how you develop businesses to keep people employed and the like, the transport in London is clearly easier to navigate, to get round, than it is in, say, a rural village, where maybe it's not just, oh, I can't get somewhere for an hour. In a rural village, it might be half a day to get to your nearest place of work or retail area. And I think so you asked sort of, is it working? And maybe Dehenna will talk about where she's going, with it now, talking about investment zones and the kind of changes that we're making in terms of real hands-on delivery. But yeah, there have been some significant changes, whether it's rolling out gigabit broadband, whether it's increasing the national living wage so that people can actually feel that they're getting a fair whack of those of salary at that lower pay end. When I was actually the minister in Bays that put that up, I was determined that we weren't going to have a recovery post-COVID on the backs of the lowest paid in society. That's why we gave the biggest cash increase in the national living wage ever. But I think I remember, again, from my business minister background, I remember there's one guy that really hit home to me about what levelling up is and how he's already benefiting from what we've done. So when I went to Lancaster, and the council there, their adult social services building, and changed it, a lovely building. They didn't need it anymore. They'd consolidated and they changed it into a digital hub, a sort of growth hub for small businesses. And this guy there was saying, you know what, I'm from Lancaster, born and bred, I can start my business here. I've got the people around me that I can take on when I need to. He was building up a bit of a global footprint with digital business. I don't need to go to Liverpool or Manchester. Didn't mention London, where people have been going to London since Dick Whittington was a boy. But he was talking about Liverpool and Manchester because that's the draw, that's the centres of gravity around, from Lancaster. But he didn't need to go there. He could set up his business and succeed in Lancaster. We want to make sure that is in every single city. We want to make sure people are mobile, clearly, but if they choose to go to Liverpool, Manchester, London, or even Lancaster, whatever, that's up to them. But that should be their choices. We want to free up people to be able to make those choices rather than actually force them into forced choices. And so what we've seen now over the last few weeks is a government in a hurry. We know that we're in midterm at the moment. We've had 2.5 years of COVID and leading straight into the war in Ukraine. But we've got to deliver on our 2019 manifesto, and we've got to deliver on our support for people that are really hard pressed in the cost of living crisis. And the cost of living crisis has really actually shone a light on why levelling up is so important to get this right. And that's why things like investment zones are so important. I was in Ebbsfleet in Kent last Monday, when actually there's 15,000, the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation have been gradually building a target of 15,000 homes into a garden city down there. But actually what an investment zone can do in Ebbsfleet, in the centre of that, where there's some land earmarked for industrial, an industrial investment zone that they're proposing to strip back some of the planning bureaucracy, to give them the tax breaks to attract investment in there, to give them the jobs and the support that they need to actually really drive that house building, drive the city or the town as a comprehensive, cohesive town rather than just a dormitory town, because it is only 18 minutes into King's Cross. So that's really part of that of town building, place shaping, if you like, as we used to call it when I was a councillor back in the noughties. So I'll probably leave it there, and it'd be really interesting to have the discussion.
Great, thank you, Paul. So the Levelling Up white paper, one part of it, central part of it, particularly when Michael Gove, who we've heard a lot from today, was in charge, very much focused on local leadership and talks of every county having a sheriff and really driving that. Is there something different now in terms of local leadership and devolution that you might be bringing as Minister for Local Government, the new Minister for Local Government?
I don't think so. I think, obviously we're putting the focus on economic growth. That's why investment zones are such a key part of that, of the change that we've seen to really turbocharge Freeport Plus, if you like. But in terms of local leadership, I think where we've seen really successful economic growth and place shaping in economic terms is when you've got the combined authority model, where you've got a strong mayor, you've got strong leadership. That's absolutely key. So over the last 2.5 years as business minister, I was pushing people through to growth hubs to look for how they can start, grow and scale their businesses. And they work fine, but actually there's a far more cohesive patchwork that you can bring together if you have the successor of growth hubs, the successor of LEPs, all working under that really strong local leadership, which also then goes into education, to skills, and all the other things that really bring levelling up together.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, we'll move now on to Hetan.
Thanks very much. So I think, the question we must all be asking is levelling up dead in the water? It's a new administration, so let's see. Time will tell, but it's not yet been mentioned by the Prime Minister. Obviously, we've seen a pivot to the kind of growth agenda, and I think that's really good. The UK's had woeful productivity growth for over a decade and a half, so that is a very important question we should be asking. But just on levelling up itself, if we're about to see spending cuts, which Simon Clarke mentioned yesterday, those are likely to hit public services, which underpin a lot of the levelling up white paper missions. So that, I think, will be problematic. We've seen the health inequality review, which was basically the main way of delivering on the health white paper mission, scrapped. Investment zone seems to be the big new idea, bit underdeveloped, but let's see how that goes. So I think, it's a moment, it's certainly transformational times, I suppose. Levelling up outcomes matter alongside growth. So we all want to live in a world with high education and skills, with health and well-being, with good housing, good places, etc., etc. Now, I suspect this government's philosophy is to say that those are outcomes. Growth is the way that you get there. You need good growth to deliver on this. And I think I'd agree, but my key point is that the causation runs in both directions. So actually, you need the levelling up outcomes to also deliver on growth. And so you need high skills, you need R&D, you need investment in infrastructure. If you're a business looking at where to invest, those things matter alongside tax and so on. So, it may well be because there was a mini budget, we've heard one bit of the government's agenda and not the rest. But I think that it's going to be important to sort of move along on some of those wider issues. And of course, we've seen in recent years that you can't think of economies divorced from wider resilience on health, for example, with the pandemic. That had enormous effects on the economy, but wasn't a kind of economic issue to start with. Flooding, environmental resilience is key to the economy. And so thinking about community resilience and how we support that, I think is going to be a really core part of any route to growth. We're all feeling the impact of inflation at the moment. Food prices, energy prices. There's been a big intervention by the government on this, but it will still feel the costs. And I think nearly 2 million people will be coming off their fixed rate mortgages this year. And even if you're not a homeowner, then those costs will be passed on to you in the rental market. So I think there's a lot of people who'll be saying, growth feels very abstract, very kind of distant. If you're in, Redcar or Mansfield, you didn't see the proceeds of growth last time. You'll feel like, am I going to see them this time? So I suppose my view is that the Levelling Up White Paper was a really good chunky bit of work. It was built up over time. There was a lot of evidence that went into it. And it also took a very holistic view of life. I'd be reluctant to throw it out too quickly. And the key point, and I'll finish here, is that there are many pathways to growth. And if you look at countries like Australia, like Canada, like Germany, they are richer than us, but they've also achieved that in a way that has less inequality than we do. So let's pick a pathway to growth that is high skill, high in community, low in regional inequality. I don't care whether you call it levelling up or not, but that's, I think, the choice that we face. Thank you.
So when you say they're richer than us, these other countries, you're talking GDP per capita?
That's right.
Right. So my understanding of the evidence around, levelling up is not necessarily something new. Governments of all stripes since the late 60s have tried regeneration initiatives. And it seems that it can make a difference, some initiatives, but over a long period of time, and it's quite marginal, the impact. What matters more seems to be the level of private and public sector investment into those areas. So thinking about growth in so-called left-behind areas and how you get that, the government's obviously flagship thing is investment zones. Do you think that's going to be enough, or do you think there needs to be much more, particularly for growth in left-behind areas?
Yeah, I think in a sense what I was articulating is it doesn't. So I don't yet know what an investment zone is, and more will be sort of said. Perhaps the Minister will say more, but it feels to me that you've got to think about R&D. You've got to think about infrastructure. So are universities involved in investment zones? I don't know. So. And I think the other thing about the missions in the white paper were that they were with a 2030 target. So your point about long term is very important. And I feel that, if I was in the private sector, I'd be saying, well, levelling up feels like it's pivoted quite hard. I don't understand it. There may be a general election in 2 years' time. It may shift again. So that certainty of policy making starts to feel a bit more fluid as well.
Great, thank you. It was going to be Duncan next, but then we'd have all the blokes speaking first, so we're not going to have that. So, Dehenna, as Minister for Levelling Up, over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to all of you for kind of coming along today to listen to us, but also to feed in your questions and your ideas. Because levelling up is a very big mission. We know that. I mean, just looking at the white paper itself, it was a big document which shows it's a big mission and there's a lot of challenges that we have to overcome here. And taking on this role, you know, I've seen this narrative emerging that the government is somehow abandoning levelling up. And I just have to say it bluntly, it's absolute nonsense. Levelling up is absolutely at the heart of what this government under Liz Truss is aiming to do, hoping to achieve, and at the core of everything that we are doing. And frankly, for me, levelling up isn't just buzzwords, it's not just kind of something that sounds good or looks good on a leaflet. For me, it's very much my ethos. You know, I grew up in a council house on a council estate, and I was one of the lucky kids who managed to get a scholarship to a really good school, and it's got me to where I am today. But I don't want kids' outlooks and kids', you know, opportunities to be determined by the postcode that they grew up in. And that's really at the core of what levelling up is all about. It's making sure that we're spreading those opportunities right across the country so that whether you're from Bath or Bishop Auckland or Birkenhead, you can get on in life if you've got the drive and the talent and the willingness to succeed. And that's what it's all about. So for me, as someone who really sees this at my very core, there is no way I would take on a role with the brief levelling up minister if I didn't think this was something that was at the core of what the government's trying to deliver on. So that's me getting that bit. The soapbox is done. It's so important, and Hetan, you're right there in talking about how we absolutely need a holistic approach to this. And I think that's what the Levelling Up white paper really was aiming to do. You'll have seen the key missions there. They weren't just talking about things alongside growth. They were talking about pay and employment. They were talking about public transport. They were talking about broadband. They were talking about pride in place and life expectancy and crime. The only way that we're really going to achieve levelling up is making sure that this is a proper cross-departmental effort. And that is what's going on at the moment. You know, there's a Levelling Up Cabinet Committee, which takes place to look at some of these issues. In my own department, we've been doing things called deep dives, which was new lingo to me a month ago when I took on this role. But effectively, we send our team of experts into an area to examine what those core local challenges are and see how we can work cross-departmentally to try and unlock them. So we ran a very successful one in Grimsby, where we discovered, talk about this for niche, we discovered there was a massive issue over Russian sanctions with regards to whitefish, which had the potential to affect 6,000 jobs in Grimsby. And all it took was a little bit of a tweak at DEFRA and a little bit of a tweak at DIT, very simple stuff to make sure there was an exemption that protected those jobs. Without that deep dive at DLUG, we probably would never have known that. And we're hoping to do many more of these deep dives to really see how we can thread together policy cross-department in order to make sure that we're helping these local areas achieve and really aspire and go on to do great things. So it's going to be a very big mission. There's an awful lot to do, but Paul mentioned this point about local leadership, which is so very important. Because I think what local communities definitely don't need is Westminster telling them what to do and what is right for them. It's about empowering local areas to have the right powers and in order for them to be able to get on and make decisions that are right for their communities. And that's why the devolution agenda is so vitally important. And as Paul said there, that strong local leadership in the form of elected mayors with additional powers around things like transport really can help areas to thrive. And we've seen it. I mean, you know, I'm very fortunate in the northeast to be right on the border of Ben Houchen's patch, an incredibly successful mayor who's done incredible things in regenerating Teesside. And looking at the job growth that Ben Houchen has delivered as mayor, working alongside his local MPs, working alongside his local councils, I think really is levelling up in action and shows that devolution absolutely is part of the answer to this. And another part of the answer, we've heard it mentioned, investment zones. And I've had so many people over the last few weeks kind of ask me what investment zones are all about. I'll give you the sort of 60-second elevator pitch here. Effectively, we're choosing geographical areas where we provide things like tax incentives, we provide bits of planning deregulation to help investment speed up, to help encourage new investment into areas, to bring opportunities to areas, particularly left behind areas that perhaps haven't had it before. So we're looking at things like tax breaks, getting businesses in to invest, bringing commercial developments, bringing factories, bringing manufacturing, but also looking on the housing side as well, because we recognise that planning is very important. It's important we get it right, but sometimes it's far too complex and far too slow. And we know there's a huge challenge around housing in this country. We can't shy away from that. So we're looking at working with local communities, empowering them to make sure we can speed up housing developments, speed up commercial developments too in these very small areas. There's the pitch. It's very exciting. It's a cracking policy. We are working on it at pace because I think as a government we really recognise that it is so, so crucial that we get the overall economy growing, that we get local economies growing as well. And that's why investment zones, I think, are going to be a really crucial puzzle piece to making sure that we can deliver levelling up. I'll leave it there, but very happy to answer any of your questions.
Great, thank you again. Very thoughtful and reassuring speech about the priority that the government's giving around levelling up. I mean, one challenge is, people would say, well, government's now borrowing a lot more money since the mini budget. And if they're going to borrow that much money, why has the tax cuts gone to larger companies, to higher earners? If levelling up was really the priority, why not increase the personal allowance? Why not uprate the value of universal credit? Why not prioritise that? Because that would help people in so-called left-behind areas in levelling up more than the tax cuts for larger earners and larger companies.
But it's all about going for growth, isn't it? I mean, this is the absolute thing. We recognise that we have a real challenge on our hands, and growth over recent years has been pretty stagnant. We had a pandemic, which definitely didn't help in that regard, and now we've got 2 years as a government to really turbocharge growth and make sure that our entire economy is firing on all cylinders. And that's why I think having a low tax approach is absolutely the right way to go. Now, of course, we need to make sure that in the medium to long term, we are being fiscally responsible. I mean, we're Conservatives, we do believe in fiscal responsibility, absolutely. But we're in very unusual times, and that's why it takes bold, radical measures. And I think the budget that was announced, sorry, it's not a budget, the mini budget, the fiscal event that was announced on Friday, I think absolutely has some incredible things in there, not least investment zones, which I have to mention. I get basically points from the department every time I mention them in speaking engagements. But no, it's going to be fantastic. We need to get the economy growing. That's exactly what we're aiming to do. Because it's going to benefit everyone. It's going to benefit the entire country if our overall economy is growing. There's more cake to share around for everyone.
Great, thank you, Dehenna. So, Duncan, we'll move to you now. What's your sort of political reading of this? Is a Liz Truss government moving away from levelling up, or is it a new type of levelling up that's being approached?
You could call it a new type of levelling up, or you could just call it something else entirely. Because if you think about the sort of Johnson vision of levelling up, it felt very redistributive. And if there's one thing the Truss government's made clear is that they don't like the word redistribution. They're very sort of down on that. There was a sort of Johnsonian idea that the North could rise, so the South could put on its slippers. Basically, that you wouldn't have to have lots of sort of messy development in the Southeast. You would have less home building and things that they don't want. Whereas in the North, you've got people like Ben Hoosh and things like that. They want the development to happen there. And so it's about fundamentally redistributing things. Whereas all the rhetoric coming out of the Truss government is that it's just a sort of pedal to the metal. It's about just getting every single part of the British economy sort of firing. So that is quite different from my point of view, but I don't think it's necessarily bad for regions outside the southeast, because I do think if you increase growth there, that will be good, even if it increases in London by a little bit more. It doesn't close the gap. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem, and I don't think the Truss government will necessarily see it as that much of a problem. But I'm willing to be corrected on that because I'm not in it. Just in general on like how to do levelling up and do it well. There's a few things. Make sure that regions sort of are able to sort of lean into their strengths. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a university local, make sure that you're not shackling student numbers, because that would be one of the most damaging things you can do in these towns, where it will be one of the main sort of economic actors. And also lean into the strengths of areas. So Teesside's already been mentioned. Teesside's probably the yimbiest place in Britain. You've got other places where they're sort of campaigning against nuclear power stations. You've got Ben Hooch sort of waving, desperately having to have one built in his patch. And so just lean into that. If they want it, give it to them. Like it is up to that. Can only happen via central government, so that does need to happen. And the other advice would be sort of don't skimp on things. So there's two ways. There's sort of the cheap way of doing levelling up, where you can just sort of make areas nicer, which will always be the first thing that gets cut when things are when times are tough, as they probably will be in the next coming years. But that does depress people. Like when your high street's bluntly a bit shit, it really does cast a pall over the whole town. Even if everyone's sort of commuting elsewhere and everything's sort of fine. And in the same way, on the sort of bigger stuff, like it's what people talk about sort of merits of tram systems versus merits of bus systems, and if in an ideal world with everyone being economically rational, actually you probably just have a bus system and just make sure it works better. But if you build a tram system in an area, it becomes a ratchet. Trams are extremely cheap to run and basically impossible to cut. You will never just delete it, whereas people do just sort of cut rural bus services. So make sure that there's a ratchet effect, and make sure that it can't be sort of undone easily. And there's another point, sort of development in the Conservative Party that I've been interested in the past sort of 5-6 years since the Brexit referendum, which is sort of the death of Tabatism. So it's like the opposite, Norman Tebbit's line about you need to, get on your bike and look to work. It's sort of become to get off your bike and wait. Like something will come to your area. And I think that's sort of quite dangerous because, like, it's to use Paul's example. So like it would be better if people could just sort of stay in Lancaster rather than sort of having to move to Manchester. But they will almost certainly be less productive, like on a sort of macro level. Like agglomeration factors do exist, and we do have the problem in the city that it's not so much that town struggling, it's that regional cities like Manchester, like Liverpool, like Birmingham, like Newcastle. They are struggling. They are poorer and smaller than their European counterparts. And so I don't think that necessarily fixes that problem. If you strengthen Lancaster, I don't think that fixes the sort of macro problem. And so if you do have this sort of mindset where it is okay to, commute 45 minutes or so, like no one ever talks about the sort of left behind Guildford. Like, it's fine. If you had Manchester that was as rich as London, every single town around Manchester would be much better off as well. So I do worry fundamentally about that from a levelling up perspective.
Great, thank you, Duncan. It strikes me that at the sort of heart of the Conservative Party there's a battle between two sort of intellectual movements. The first is the sort of libertarians and the second is the communitarians. And, there's what you were saying, the sort of focus being less on, helping Billy Elliot escape and do well. It's more actually where Billy Elliot's come from will raise it up. And that's felt that the communitarians have really sort of prioritised that. Whereas the libertarians are always about let's give something to the individual and then let them fly and go somewhere else. Yeah. Do you think, Liz Truss is a libertarian, really? That's where her instincts are.
Absolutely.
Do you think that shifts the balance back towards that get on your bike and go wherever you want to?
In the short term, yes, but in the long term, no, because I don't. I think the thing that I outlined is probably quite unpopular. And if you look at the sort of poll ratings, that does seem to be being borne out. It does feel like that sort of Johnson vision for the country was liked by voters. Then there was a lot of midterm problems, but that's no longer on the menu. I'm just fundamentally not sure that the Truss model will be that popular.
Okay, so we'll move now to Zoe, and we have been doing this partnership also at Labour Party conference. So we were in Liverpool last week, and I was speaking, and I'm here. I survived, and essentially what really came through there was this idea that there was a perception that the Truss government had vacated the ground, that was the narrative coming. And so Labour could move into that levelling up space. Hearing what the ministers have said, is that still your judgment?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's, as the panellists have been saying so far, it's more about the approach that's radically shifted from a narrative of investment to one of tax cuts and deregulation. And that's the shift that's seen and felt very publicly. The difference between the kind of Johnson-led and the Truss-led government, and maybe that's something that the new ministerial team support, and that's fine. But that is the shift, and that I think does change from a narrative which was seen as a positive narrative, a reason to invest in places. The UK is never going to be the cheapest place to do business, and nor shouldn't it be. There's good reason why it costs money to do business in the UK. We have great skills system, education system, public health system. Amongst the fact that it's obviously great just to live here anyway. So we shouldn't engage in this kind of race to the bottom mentality, and that's, I guess, my fear with the change in approach from the investment to the tax cut and deregulation-led approach. I mean, look, I think it's still very much politically the right thing to do, and I think that's why people were a bit surprised that Truss took such a different approach to the same question as the Johnson-led government. obviously, that will come back around again when the next general election's called, and we'll see about that. But it's also what the public want still. So it still polls very, top of the list in terms of the types of inequality that people care the most about. So I'm really pleased that, Dehenna and Paul are here and engaging in the topic still, because it is, as you both know, in different ways in your different parts of the country all too well. Economically, I would say, again, that there has been a shift with the Truss government from a kind of grow your regions, grow the country, which was the narrative a few weeks ago, to one that feels more like just grow and then we'll kind of sort it out later as to where and who benefits from that growth. And again, I think that feels like quite a dramatic shift, and I would certainly support the sort of grow your regions first. I run a think tank based in Manchester and Newcastle. I live in Liverpool. It's not just a personal bias. It's happening. These regions are wanting to partake in growth and be driving the country forward. So let's not leave them out of that narrative now, because it feels a bit precarious. Really interesting that you picked up, Duncan, on this kind of principle of, what's the balance between bringing the economic activity to people versus getting on your bike. And probably it's a sort of messy answer of somewhere in between the two. But yeah, I think, broadly, great that the levelling up agenda is still at the heart of what the government wants to do. I think the white paper, there was a broad range of outcomes there, 12 outcomes with lots of subheadings and things. I think the question for the new ministerial team is what you prioritise underneath that, because I think that was the thing that was lacking from it. It was kind of like, there was not much to disagree with, but it was kind of like, well, where do you put your first pound then, And I would just pick up on something you were saying, Hetan, about the kind of the two-way relationship between inequality and economic growth. Like, if you allow the country to get less equal, that will be a drag on economic growth. So I see, reducing inequality and improving economic growth as two sides of the same coin. These aren't two separate objectives. They should be placed firmly together. And that's much now like established mainstream thinking. The IMF says that's the case. We've seen over time that less equal countries grow less fast. So that's kind of an established economic fact now. So in terms of what next, I'd say I'm slightly sceptical of the investment zone approach, but want it to succeed. I did actually spend my Sunday morning reading the prospectus that came out today. I should apologise, but I'm in a room of conference on a Sunday, so I think we're amongst friends in that sense. And I guess for me, the bit I'm kind of most sceptic about is the tax cut approach, because I think that could end up being a very expensive way of shifting economic activity from one place to their neighbouring authority. And I think, the enterprise zones of 2011 actually showed that that's what happens. And in my mind, these are kind of a very similar version of that same thing. So I think that's the thing we've got to guard against. The bit about like planning deregulation and actually wanting to build more homes, I'm really supportive of that. So if investment zones are a way of like packaging up planning liberalisation in an acceptable way to people, maybe that's the interesting part of it, and less so the tax zones, which I think, as I say, UK is never going to be the cheapest place to do business. It shouldn't be, so let's not engage into a race to the bottom, either within the UK, within the European community, or broader. So finally, I'd just like to pick up on kind of what's been mentioned on public services. We're doing a project at the moment on, you guessed it, levelling up. And public services comes back every time for when we do focus groups, citizen conversations, polling about the thing that people are really concerned about. And I think people have lost a sense of like what they should expect from public services, whether that's your local public services, like what should you be able to expect? Like, how far should you be able to live from a library, your doctor's surgery, your leisure centre? They kind of lost that sense. And I think I kind of hesitate. I don't want to get the levelling up agenda muddled, that it's kind of becomes a theory of everything. So I think it's almost right that we kind of pick out what's levelling up and what's getting your public services right and what's the basic offer to people. But I think we've got to be clear that those are two distinct things, that people really want both, and it's not one or the other.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move straight to Ailbhe.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm joined here today from Power to Change. We're an independent trust that supports communities to run community businesses. And so our work is all about supporting communities to make places thrive, and hence this topic is obviously core to what we do. And I'm really pleased to hear the Minister, support that agenda and say that levelling up is still very much a priority. I think what matters to us, or what we've been thinking about, is that what matters is for levelling up to be felt by communities, so that people really see that it touches their lives. And I think that's about power and investment really coming down to that community level. so people can see that. And so there's, in terms of an assessment of what's happened so far and where we've got to, I think there has been some good progress. The Levelling Up white paper was a decent piece of work. There's good money. There's levelling up funds are being made available. There is a good amount of funding being made available. I think the challenge is how that money is being made available. It's still, in my view, too Westminster centric and too controlled from Whitehall. And actually, why are we not working towards empowering communities to actually take some of these funds and do that themselves at a much more local level? On sort of moving powers down, I think the devolution agenda is also great. And there's York and North Yorkshire and also hopefully East Midlands. So there is good progress. But we would like to see that go beyond. So the mayoral level is fantastic, but how do we go from the mayoral down to the community and neighbourhood level? And what can we put in place to try and ensure that in those combined authorities, actually at a neighbourhood and community level, people can sort of feel that change? And the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill is obviously partway through its journey. Similarly, there's some good things in that bill that we would welcome. Things like high street rental auctions. So high streets are, when people think about levelling up and when they're polled and when they're asked about it, high streets features all the time because it's a really visible sense of a place declining or indeed picking up. And so that's really matters to people, and we think that's a very important area to focus on. Also, there's some really good things in there, like the 25% of the infrastructure levy going down to that sort of community level through neighbourhood forums and parish councils or town councils. So I think there's lots of good progress. And I suppose it's worth thinking about, why does levelling up matter, I suppose, to people, and why does it matter in particular to those newer Conservative voters? And it is those things that I've touched on and some of the panel have talked about, around how people feel about the place where they live and they feel about their chances, but also about power. There's quite a bit around people's feelings, that actually. So with some polling that we had done earlier in the summer, 71% of those 2019 Conservative voters agreed that to deliver on the spirit of Brexit and people's desire to take back control, government needs to give people more of a say about what happens to shape their communities. So that desire is still there and it hasn't yet been met. And equally, I think mayors, whilst they have achieved a lot, it hasn't necessarily yet shifted public opinion. So polling in those combined authorities shows that over 70% of people in those areas still don't feel like that having the mayor has actually made that tangible difference to their empowerment and their ability to shape decisions. So there is more to do, I think, about bringing that down to that neighbourhood level. A couple of specific ideas from us, and then I'll wind up because I know we want to have some discussion. So, high street rental auctions and some of those changes are really welcome, but we'd like to see that go further. Community right to buy is something that we've talked about, and we've worked with partners to develop the idea. It has been tried elsewhere, and it would give communities that first right of refusal, and it would really empower people to say, actually, there's an important asset in my high street. It's vacant. It's been neglected by absent owners. We would like to do something about that, and why can't we back them to do that? The infrastructure levy, which I mentioned, is fantastic, but there's a very small change that would make a difference. At the moment, parish councils, neighbourhood forums can access that money, but parish councils tend to be in wealthier areas, and a lot of the country isn't parished. A lot of places don't have neighbourhood forums. So can we work with community organisations? Can we try out those community covenants, which were in the white paper, to make sure that every place can access that money and actually exercise that power? I think that's probably it for me. I'll wrap up, but just, I wanted to sort of sum up. Essentially, we're a charitable trust working in a lot of the places where levelling up is really felt and really needed. And it's those two sides, I think, that we want to see further action on. It's that power devolved right down and access to funding in a way that people really understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ailbhe. Very detailed stuff there and some good ideas. So we're going to open it up to questions now and contributions. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. And just to remind people on the live stream to ask through Slido and ask questions, and I will field them. And to keep using our hashtag if you're tweeting, which is hashtag #BrightBlue, hashtag CPC22. Right, please do wait for the microphone to come before you ask your question, because people on the live stream need to hear. So we'll start with this gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Eddie Rigger. I'm Cabinet Member at Lancashire County Council for Economic Development and Growth. And I was there with Paul that day a year ago when he came to visit our digital hub. So hearing him talk about that in such glowing terms will mean a lot to the staff and all our councillors back there. I want to ask a question regarding devolution, because in Lancashire we're trying to show that local place leadership. We created our own levelling up fund in our budget last year. We created a £5 million fund to support our district's levelling up fund bids. We've put our names forward for an investment zone in the early patch. So we're trying to show that local leadership, and we're delivering, as the Minister has outlined. But Lancashire is a place that isn't keen on the mayor. We have the self-proclaimed King of the North next to us, with his sidekick Steve Rotherham, and Ben Houchin does deliver great stuff. Not everywhere mayors are the answer. So I wonder if one of the ministers could confirm whether the government is still keen to support devolution to county combined authorities without a mayor.
Okay, I'm just going to take some more questions, but that's probably one for Paul. Okay, so this chap here.
Thank you very much. Nick Garden from Community Organisers. It was interesting to hear Australia mentioned, primarily because Australia had a social inclusion board established because they saw the need to link social inclusion to economic growth. Now, they put social inclusion to 4 headings: learn, work, engage and have a voice. And within the Levelling Up paper, there was a strategy for spaces and relationships. So how do we see the link between engagement and having a voice with the Levelling Up strategy, which seems to be focused a lot on economic growth?
Okay, and then let's have this gentleman here.
Good afternoon. Questions and contributions. So this comes from the contribution side. I'm Kevin Stevens from an organisation called E5. We're piloting a new social care model, which is about to be signed with Dudley Council. It's a regenerative, sustainable social value and social infrastructure model that helps towards regeneration. Dudley require 10 of these care hubs, as we're calling them. They're about 30 million apiece. We have funds for that. We are looking to roll it out nationally. Funnily enough, we're just building a new community next to Grimsby Hospital. So if you've been in Grimsby, Dehenna, then you may come across Kings Park. We're working with Leah Nietzsche there, MP for Grimsby. So this is a hub that is proving very successful, and the social care infrastructure that we're going to be providing doesn't cost local authorities any capital input, doesn't require a grant, that's never been done before, and it sits within housing discretionary budgets. We're doing a fringe event on this at 3:30 in the Snarter Room over the road at the Hyatt on Tuesday, and it got missed out the agenda, and Kerry apologises profusely at the Conservative Party for that. But we've got...
Could I ask you to come to the question? You've been promoting a lot, which is
We
great.
have.
I would do the same, but come to the question.
Yeah,
please.
so in terms of how that's seen out with the Levelling Up, obviously it's designed to help with that, with part of the regeneration. Do we think things like our initiative would benefit from the enterprise zone type model or promotion regionally, or is it expected for the private sector to do it without that? We can in this instance do it without it, but we can think of plenty of other community projects that that are going to need that kind of support in our view.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to take one more question in this round. So this gentleman here.
David Barker, Association of Apprentices. Apprenticeships are a great way to help young people get out of unemployment into work. The problem is at the moment nearly 50% are dropping out of their apprenticeships, not completing, and the number one reason is lack of support for them during the apprenticeship. So I just wonder, in these levelling up zones, enterprise zones, could there be more support for apprentices, especially in those areas?
Thank you very much. Nice short question there. Dehenna, do you want to come on to any of those questions?
I'll do my best. I want to come back to our chat from Lancashire. I didn't catch your name, I'm afraid.
Ailbhe.
Ailbhe, well, thank you so much for your question. I know mayors can be quite controversial for some people, and indeed in County Durham at the moment we're currently having this discussion about which level we want to go in for on the devolution front. I mean, you'll know from the white paper that the intention is that by 2030 any area that wants a local devolution deal can have one, assuming we can agree terms, of course. And there are different tiers of deal that can be achieved. Tier 1 and 2 could be achieved without a mayor, and then your tier 3 with all the best juicy bits of powers and cash pots. They're the bits where you would need to have a mayor. That is the model that we're working on and will continue to work on for your county combined authorities and otherwise. I think it really does come down to that local accountability point, doesn't it? And I know that there is a fear sometimes amongst our party that in some of those more urban areas it makes it a very difficult election for us to win. And we have to be aware of the politics of this, of course. But I think we just need to fight harder if that's the case. Go in, get all the powers, get all the tax benefits, get all the funding, and then fight even harder to make sure that you get a good mayor in. Because frankly, if we get a Labour mayor in and they're rubbish, it gives us an incentive to get them out next time, doesn't it? And to really encourage that local community to vote blue. So I'm all in favour of mayors, I have to say.
Great. And Paul, is there any point that you want to come back on?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of talked a little bit about apprenticeships. And, oh, by the way, in terms, did I hear Dudley was the cab?
Yeah.
So I actually saw one of your colleagues in the LGA reception, so she called me to talk about that. I'm really keen to come and see what's happening. I've had a summer I look after stewardship, where interventions in council. So it's nice to see some good things going on. So rather than some of those, for my own sanity. So I'd love to come and see that. In terms of apprenticeships, obviously, the more. Yes, we want to have them be as supportive as we can. The more local that we can have that, the better it is. Hence the levelling up, because it's better than trying to direct everything out of Whitehall, because there's just no way you can track the kind of support unless you do the polling, which is actually then far too late for the people that are involved, the 50% that are falling out. So the more we can work and create that structure locally, it goes back to exactly why local governance are right at the heart of the Levelling Up White Paper.
Great, and Hetan, maybe the question around inclusion and local voice in shaping Levelling Up.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Hetan first, Paul, if you want to come to that.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it comes back to Ailbhe's point about power. So this is not just about outcomes of services, it's actually about people feeling power and control. And just quite an interesting paper that's just come out by Matt Sutton at Manchester University, looking at devolution and life expectancy, and life expectancy has improved in Manchester, and devolution has been one of the key reasons why, because it's allowed better voice and more coordination between public services at that local level. And I think, the social care example is a good one, where actually if you can understand what the features of the system are in that local area, you can make things work much more effectively than, as you say, if you're based in Westminster, you've got no sense of what's happening there.
Yeah, I would just say that again, coming back to the kind of models for devolution are very much to give accountability, and therefore the voice that's required in the first place to make those sort of changes, because then the mayor can feel that they are making those changes, having had heard the voices of the local people, by the consent of local people, because it's really important to get the second bit of devolution right, which we often forget about, and that's accountability. It's so easy, and it was always going to be the case when the Localism Act came in, 12 years ago, that there was going to be a gap. You start pushing powers down, you need to first make sure an area is ready to take those powers. That they've got the skills, the ethos, the approach required, and they understand, and people actually understand what is happening in their local area as well. Because when you're voting, who do you vote for? I'm in a political conference, so I can be as political as I want. So it can't. I'm the Minister for London. I'm sitting here listening to him time and time again over 2.5 years, saying how isn't it wonderful how well we're working together, knowing he's pressing send on an email via the press. To government, wagging a finger at government. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a mayor sitting there saying, you know what, this is all the government's fault, whether it's policing, transport, these things that are directly under a mayor's power. Otherwise, what's the point of the mayor? The mayor has to have a point, and that is all about accountability. But it comes round full circle that you need to have that voice first, so that you've heard that, you've delivered something, and then you need to be held accountable to it.
Ailbhe, are there innovative examples of voice? Of local communities really shaping and leading kind of regeneration projects that you can point to?
Yeah, lots. So we're trying out something in the moment called community improvement districts, and it's about local communities. So essentially you do have business improvement districts, but when people are starting to come back into town centres and really want to have a role in reviving them, you need the community voice alongside the business voice. So we're piloting that at the moment, bringing communities into actually making decisions about places, and that's something we'd like to see picked up elsewhere and carrying on.
Great. And Zoe, did you have, particularly on the apprenticeships point?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we had the 50% dropout rate, I think that's quite an alarming stat. I haven't heard that before, but if it's true, it is quite shocking. I mean, obviously there's a different apprenticeship hourly rate. I think that actually often the dropout rate is also to do with the kind of wraparound care for apprentices, whether that's to do with childcare or things that people don't think of, or housing, to do a package of support around apprentices to make sure they can afford to stay in their apprenticeship. So I'm glad that was really glad that was raised as a point, and that's something we should all probably take more notice of.
Great, thank you, Zoe. So Dehenna, unfortunately, has to leave us.
Sorry.
I'm very sorry that you have to go, but thank you so much. Paul then has to go shortly afterwards, but I'm going to take another quick round of questions for him. But if we could give Dehenna a round of applause, I'm very grateful to you. Okay, so another round of questions. Please make them 3-sentence max questions, because Paul has to go and I want to try and get as many people as possible. So, again, hands up if you could say who you are, and where you're from, and the microphone will come to you. So we'll start with this gentleman here. If the microphone could go to him, please. Have we got the microphone? Okay.
Great, thank you. So Stephen Muirs from Big Society Capital. One of the most interesting things for me in the the Levelling Up white paper was the desire to get local authority pension funds to invest up to 5% of their assets in driving change in their local area. And it's very interesting, partly because it's 5% of an extremely large number, so actually it's a lot of money, and also because it shows a sort of different way into unlocking different forms of capital to actually help contribute to the Levelling Up agenda alongside traditional public investment and very traditional sort of pure commercial investment. So I'm interested in hearing from the Minister or the panel, A, is that still a sort of key plank of policy? And B, are there other opportunities that the panel sees for getting in different forms of money to help drive Levelling Up alongside public and private in the classic sense?
Great, thank you. Let's have this gentleman here. If you could be short, that would be very, very useful. Thank you.
I shall shrink. Thank you very much, everyone. Mark Sears from the UCL Policy Lab. I just wanted to re-up Ryan's question, actually, which is it plausible to have a essentially communitarian plank in the platform of a very libertarian Prime Minister's government? So fantastic detail and thought-provoking ideas today. It just feels not quite the same party anymore. So just would like to hear any reflections on that.
Great, thank you. A lot of embedded clauses getting you to your 3 sentences there. Right, okay. And this lady here.
So my name is Eleanor Wills, and I'm a councillor for the southern cathedral city of Salisbury. And when my husband and I moved back to the city last year, he comes from a Bermondsey council estate and was really interested to see that actually, even though it's Salisbury and it's perceived to be wealthy, residents will complain about quite a few issues quite rightly. And I get correspondence on cuts to bus services, issues with the public library, it could be police visibility. So how do we make Levelling Up work for these southern communities and to make sure that we don't lose our voter base in the south who do vote blue as much as the Red Wall and across the country really?
Great, thank you. So, Paul, perhaps you want to answer those questions first.
Yeah, okay, so pension funds, I mean, yeah, I think to be able to have a wider remit for pension funds, to be able to trust them to invest in wider areas. What we don't want to do particularly is to dictate. Again, local councils will soon let us know, and the LGA will let us know if we're going too far on that. So it needs to be done in collaboration. But when you look at the kind of work that can be done, the fact is that we're taking loads of money for investment in this country from the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund. It always comes up every time. Why can't we be doing it from local authorities? I had a hospital in my patch which we're trying to get built, one of the 40, trying to get built. Is now we've got the government money for it. Originally, the chief exec wanted to borrow money from, I think it was Aviva, through their pension fund, patient capital, basically. They're people crying out. So pension funds are right for that local levelling up. In terms of Salisbury, sorry. I mean, I think it comes back to having stronger local leadership and trusting, being able to provide the model, being able to actually have a better connection, but the accountability that I was talking about before. Because if you've got someone that's delivering bus services, that's what's the great thing about a mayor. I understand the tensions in Lancashire, but the great thing about a mayor is there is one person there. That if your bus service is getting cut, go and speak to them. You can't hide. And I think that's, so actually, which comes back to the second question, that's quite a libertarian approach to do that. It's being, you're sort of throwing yourself open because we're giving up the levers of power from Whitehall and saying, you know what, you know best. In the same way we're talking to taxpayers saying, you spend your money better than we do, so we'll take less of it. In this terms, in governance terms, we're saying, you guys know what's happening in Salisbury. I haven't been to Salisbury for ages, and I wouldn't know the bus services in Salisbury. Why should I be telling you what to do, or you shouldn't need to write to me? You should be speaking to your local people.
Okay, and Duncan, this question for Mark, perhaps, on, levelling up is such a communitarian issue, really, within a libertarian government. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it is a bit of a paradox, bluntly. It feels like the voter coalition that Johnson put together at the last election was incredibly efficient. And the Conservatives effectively can't really afford to lose many of it. Johnson only got 300,000 more votes than Theresa May. who's sort of gone down as the least successful Prime Minister of years, whereas Johnson was the most electorally successful, and the margin between the two is tiny. So you've got this incredibly efficient vote between the two, and it feels like the places where the Conservatives may struggle to hang on will be in the seats that were meant to be levelled up. And if it was about sort of relative improvement versus the South East, then I think those people are going to be relatively disappointed by this new version of Level Up, which is just sort of, as I said before, flooring it. That's my hunch.
Great. And Paul does need to go because he's got to do a media thing.
Yeah, I'm on the radio in 5 minutes, yeah.
Right, okay. We'll let you go. So, thank you very much. A big round of applause for...
Thank you, cheers. Good to see you, Duncan.
Great, I'm going to take another round of questions. And again, so if you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. So, anybody else want to ask some questions? I hope we haven't gone quiet, the ministers have gone. Okay, so Zoe, perhaps I'll come to you. Just on this sort of, I mean, the tension in the Conservative Party, we talked about communitarian, libertarian tension. Is there a tension in the Labour Party? Maybe you could sort of talk us through that in terms of where levelling up should be or shouldn't be.
Ooh. Well, to start with, just to make clear, I don't speak on behalf of the Labour Party, but we were there at conference together, so we kind of were picking up on what the conversation was. I mean, I think, you know, the political shrewd move of levelling up was that it was traditionally Labour's territory. So I think that's the kind of the swing we've seen. And then because it took a while for the government to define what they meant by levelling up, the headline stuck, and when it's polled and when people have asked what they think, you know, that stuck. But then the detail underneath, you know, was a bit wanting, and that's why now, with a change of approach, it risks that the Conservatives lose a bit of grip of the narrative of levelling up. So I think it's a kind of moved into contested territory now, to be honest, and obviously it's great that Paul and Dehenna were here and still very much champion the approach, because I think those of us who, you know, live and work in the regions across the country very much want it to remain the central plank of the government's agenda.
Great, thank you. So, Ailbhe, just on this point around different kind of sources of funding, there is a sort of tendency, isn't there, to sort of go to government funding as the solution. But how can we harness more innovative forms of financing to support the levelling up agenda?
Yeah, I was trying to catch your eye to come in when Stephen, thank you for asking that question. Yeah, I mean, people have talked to us as well about local authority pension funds and that change in the Levelling Up white paper. And there's an idea around a high street buyout fund, which we've been putting forward recently. So the idea that funders like us could come together, but also social investment and private investment. You know, can we, and government. So you would probably want some government funding in that, but it's no longer asking for government to foot the bill for everything. But being able to say, actually, especially when you're investing in places, to be able to bring together those different funds and do something like that where we can try and combine social, commercial, private investment. Sorry, social, commercial and public investment. And to do something like that. So I think there are opportunities. It needs putting together, and we're working on that at the moment. But I think we have to start thinking like that, because obviously government can't fund all of these things in the way it potentially did in the past.
Great. And Hetan, do you see this point around, you know, I think there's a perception, a widespread perception, that levelling up is about northern areas and particularly deprived northern areas. Do you think there's a sort of danger, particularly as the Tory, you know, the sort of electoral foundations of Tory support is more in the south, that causes problems politically for the Tory party?
I mean, in a way, if we'd been having this conversation 6 weeks ago, that was a useful question to ask, and the answer would have been Boris Johnson was such a phenomenal politician. He was able to talk about levelling up the south and levelling up London, and, you know, it was a slogan, and then underneath it, Michael Gove created a very substantial policy mix. But in a way now, I mean, my bigger worry is that the policy itself has disappeared. You know, where this event itself is a legacy of a, you know, we wrote what we'd been discussing sort of several months ago. We're in quite a different period, and I think the worry, I mean, the polling, as Duncan and others were indicating, suggests that the pivot the government has made has not yet been digested or understood by the public, or if it has, they don't like what they've digested. So, and in a way, the key question is there a way of pivoting back and saying it was just a comms issue, let us explain better, or are we going to see the government now actually tack back slightly towards a more, I mean, if we're saying libertarian v communitarian, towards a more communitarian aspect. But I think there are ways of doing a kind of libertarian levelling up And one option, for example, is focusing quite a lot on the devolution bit, which is about cascade, the Brexit taking power back to sort of people, take back control. I mean, in a way, there was no reason why it had to stop at the national level. So one could see that cascading down and that being a kind of Truss version of levelling up that makes sense to her.
Great, thank you. I mean, I've got loads of questions and I can keep asking them, but has anybody else got a question? Great, so we'll go with this chap here.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm David Heathcote from the Combe Valley constituency. I agreed with Dehenna's point about levelling up, crossing government, smashing down the walls of different silos in government. And an example that I know through my work is through active ageing. That if you, an example being that if you get just 1/3 of inactive over 55-year-olds into regular, sustainable exercise, you would save over a 10-year period about £7.5 billion for the NHS just in direct costs alone. And then there are, of course, all sorts of health and well-being benefits for that. And I love the idea of the NHS, the local authorities and the community assets working together. For example, leisure centres. But leisure centres the public leisure centres don't really focus on active ageing because they know the 50%, the younger market. So I should have asked Paul earlier, is it now a time to challenge local government to actually say, if you run our leisure centres, you must have an outcomes-based target for active ageing, because I think that would have economic impacts as well as health and well-being.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? I have a question, unsurprisingly, which is the levelling up agenda, as Zoe was talking about earlier. It was not just about economic regeneration, but civic regeneration, making places where people want to live and the livability of a place, so civic activity and pride. And it feels often that children are at the heart of bringing communities together. They're sort of social glue. As a parent, you're sort of incentivized to participate in new services and institutions in an area, and your children make friends with other children, but then parents also make friends with other parents. So children really should be the heart of this levelling up, this sort of civic activity and pride stuff, but we don't really hear much about that. So I'd sort of be interested in people's thoughts around that. So there's two questions there, and then what I'm going to do is something a bit innovative, which is a reverse Q&A. So I'm going to ask the panellists to think of a question for the audience, and then we're going to see who's going to be brave in the audience to see if they can answer the question, because there are a lot of counsellors in the audience, so I think it'd be quite interesting for panellists to think about that. Yeah. So let's start with Zoe.
Yeah, if I may pick up, I think the gentleman's point around active ageing is spot on, because also that's the category of people that we've lost from the labour market since the pandemic, right? We talk about the missing million, and of the missing million that we would have expected to be additionally in the labour market right now, 400,000 of those people are out of the labour force due to ill health. And so it's kind of the issue for that age group especially. And maybe that's my question back to, we'll come back to you about, like, you know, what does local government need in order to be able to really change the dial on healthy life expectancy? Obviously, they've got public health budgets, they've got, you know, a bit of leisure centre here, and, you know, but there's a kind of, what else does local government need to be able to really change the dial on healthy life expectancy? That's one of my questions back to the audience.
Good, okay, so if anyone wants to answer that, we'll come back to you in a second. Duncan, I don't know if you had a thought on either the healthy bit or the children bit.
On the healthy bit, I think that's a really good example, because like it's exactly the things that we should be thinking about it, but I worry it's the thing that councils can't quite afford to think about, because they've got not enough money and so many sort of mandatory responsibilities that sort of, you know, active health for the over 50s comes like way down on the pecking order now. And so unless councils have more slack in the form of just more money, they're not going to be able to focus on those things, and then you just end up with these sort of false economies cascading throughout the whole system. And so if you do look at a lot of the problems with the British state writ large, is that we only try and fix problems like too late in the most expensive way, basically via the NHS. And the best way of sort of fixing it upstream would just be giving councils more resources. And so if there was like a big sort of macro criticism of levelling up, it was that it just undid a little bit of austerity. effectively. So like George Osborne slash council budgets, and then they've slowly had money sort of dribbled back via levelling up, but they're just fundamentally smaller and less generous than the settlement was before, so they can't do the things that they used to do, such as your suggestion.
Oh, and you're not allowed to talk about levelling up in the past tense.
This is true.
And do you have a question for the audience, Duncan?
Yeah, mine's a very cynical, boring one. Are the Conservatives going to win the next election?
Okay.
The
great.
journalist speech.
Yes.
Yeah. Hetan, anything on the children point?
Yeah, I mean, children aren't asked in nearly enough what they'd like, and we've just done a big British Academy project on childhood, and that was one of our main recommendations, that we have more children's voice. But I think one key point is that, of course, if you're not a parent, or your kids my kids are now at the age where they're doing their own thing, and I don't get invited to those sorts of things. So how do you create social infrastructure spaces? How do you create social infrastructure spaces that bring different kinds of people together? Because actually that's one of the issues I think that we all face. How do I bump into people? And, faith groups used to play that role, but again, life has changed and moved on. So I think that's a big question. And then a question for the audience. As you know, Ryan, I used to run the Royal Statistical Society. I was a sort of data geek. From a local perspective, for those who are kind of in different areas and regions, what are the data sets that you would find most helpful in terms of your local economy and society? Because I think one of the problems is that we have really good national data infrastructure, but actually we don't have good enough local and regional data.
Very interesting. Ailbhe, anything you want to pick up on?
Yes, I mean the questions about sort of active ageing and then children, it sort of reminds me that essentially people are at all different life stages in communities. There's all sorts of things going on. And if you think about a community, it's about that social infrastructure and social fabric. What are those places where people can mix, and be it sort of school gates or sort of, I don't know, yoga classes. Those spaces are really important. So my question is for the audience, is one that I spend all my time wondering about in my day job. It's just, how do we enable people to do that? So to grow that social infrastructure for themselves in places, rather than that it's sort of top down dictated. You must have this, it must be put there. How do we let people actually shape some of that themselves?
Great, thank you. So over to you, the audience. So 4 questions. So what does local government need to really make progress and change the dial on healthy life expectancy? Second is, are the Conservatives going to win the election? So you'll be brave enough to answer that one. Thirdly, what data sets would you find helpful at a local level? And fourthly, what do you need to grow social infrastructure in communities? Some interesting things. Who would be brave enough to answer any of that? Yes, Lord Lucas at the back.
I've been very active down in Eastbourne in trying to tackle just these problems, and my solution would be to spend more money on getting the structures right, the long-term structures that allow initiatives to succeed, and don't be tempted by just tick box, I'll fund these people. They don't do anything useful, but no one will blame me for it, which is an awful lot what goes on at the moment.
Great, thank you. Any other answers people wanted to give? Yeah, this gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Duncan from Lloyds Bank Foundation, Independent Charitable Trust. So take your 4th one, Ryan. I think you need long-term sustainable funding for local government. When the cuts are needed to make up the budgets, they always look at welfare and local government, and actually local government getting core unrestricted funding to do what it does best, and then new sources of finance that support communities alongside local government, so a community well fund or something similar, which means that there's finance that stay at the local level to support charities, community groups and others.
Thank you, Duncan. Any other answers people want to give? This gentleman here.
Just on the data sets so I became a social entrepreneur in 2005. So my social enterprise trained unemployed young people. What drives me is a statistic I picked up sort of a decade ago. 1 in 6 NEETs die within 10 years of becoming NEET. Now I believe that is true. I was NEET myself. A lot of my friends that I grew up with are no longer here. But I can't find any more data on that. So I'm just wondering, do we need more reality data that will help drive a lot of our interventions?
That is a very stark statistic, actually, if that is the case, yeah. Any other answers people wanted to give? Yeah, this lady here. Thank you.
It's on the data point. I find this really interesting in terms of, as a councillor, getting to know the community that I represent. And I was in an event earlier on today, and it was talking about how often you get some really loud voices in the community. And actually, when you're trying to work out anything from a planning decision to issues around cycling and walking infrastructure, or it could be public transport issues. It could just be a resident who feels that the council has sort of let them down in some way, whether it's housing. There are so many issues at that local level. And I know this probably sounds really silly, but actually sometimes I wish I had polling data, because I have to go around and speak to essentially everyone on the doorstep. You've got to knock on the doors, you've got to say what's the issue. And one of the things I really want to do as a councillor, I've been doing street surgeries and really getting out and speaking to people, but I don't see the mechanisms in local government, which is just a general sort of residents forum type thing, and even at the area boards and things, it's always the loudest voices. So if there was actually more data on really what do residents think, what do they want, what's on their mind, it would actually help to build the relationships, and for me to steer my policy decisions.
So sort of local but representative samples and polling. Yeah, very interesting. Any other answers? Yes, this gentleman here.
The final question. I'm from Barnsley, moved there 10 years ago. To say it's a left-wing area is an understatement. 3 miles from where I live, the miners' strike started at Cortonwood. A couple of miles from where I live, they burnt the effigies of Mrs. Thatcher at Goldthorpe. So I've always been political, and I thought, let's have a little look at Barnsley. And last May, I was the first Conservative councillor to be elected in almost 50 years. So to answer your question, the impossible is possible.
Very good conclusion to this discussion. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you in particular to IPPR North and Power to Change for the partnership both here at Conservative Party Conference but also at Labour Party Conference. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to those, if anybody is out there, hello. Thank you for listening in. Just to say that you've got these fringe guides, and we've got loads of events. We're doing 33 in total, and I'm feeling very tired just saying that. But we have one at 6:15 in this room, which is looking at how you break the junk food cycle. So if you want to learn about that, please come along. And we've also got one at the same, a little bit later at 6:30, but outside the secure zone in Joy's Inn, which is on planning and how we get both greater but also greener housing. So please do take this, and to take the goodie bags on your chairs as well. If you're interested in Bright Blue and want to become a member, we're offering a kind of £10 membership for the year, just exclusively during the conference. Speak to Max at the back there who stood up if you're interested in learning more. And yeah, just I think we sort of finalise with a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.